Hi, this is TheoryBoard from Irijule. It's a MIDI controller designed to give you easy access to multiple musical scales. What makes it special are its chord and live modes, which I'll explain of course, as well as the sheer number of scales implemented in it. In this video, I'll take a look at what it can do, its pros and cons, and where it fits within the landscape of software and hardware tools aimed at helping you compose and perform music. Before I start, the usual Kickstarter disclaimer: I'm not affiliated with this project in any way other than they sent me this review unit, and the links to the campaign in the description are not affiliate links. Kickstarter campaigns are always risky, but that said, since this is the second Kickstarter for this company and product, perhaps a little less so. It's worth noting, to the credit of the team, that they not only made it through the first Kickstarter, but the product they ultimately delivered has substantially more features compared to what was originally promised, so hopefully all goes well and the same thing happens here. Okay, so with that said, what's TheoryBoard? Overall, it's a MIDI controller that was designed to play chords and melodies that are aligned to scales as opposed to regular MIDI controllers that look like a piano keyboard and give you access to all 12 chromatic notes at once. This intentional limitation makes it hard to hit wrong notes or play a chord that doesn't fit within your song. The way it works is you choose an overall scale, which really means the intervals of the notes selected within the 12 possible chromatic options within the regular Western scale. Most people are familiar with the major scale, so let's pick that. Then you choose the mode of the scale, meaning where along those note intervals you want your scale to start. And then once you've selected the mode, I'll go with major because that's what I guess most people are familiar with, you can choose the key, or which specific note or pitch the scale will start at, the actual root note of the scale. Once you've selected the scale, you don't need to dive back into the menu to change that based on the existing scale. You can choose modes using the mode button. So for example, if I wanted to go to minor or Aeolian mode, that's the 6th mode of the major scale. If I wanted to transpose the scale up and down, I could do that using these buttons as well. If you want to break out of the scale limitation, you can always choose the 12 note or chromatic scale. You'll still see the notes of the scale highlighted, but you can play the chromatic notes in between the notes of the scale. In this case, these are the black keys on the keyboard, but that won't always be the case based on which mode you choose. Let's say, for example, choose a minor mode. Let's go for minor C. In this scale, the black keys are part of the scale, and there are some, quote, white keys that are outside the scale. It's beyond the scope of this video to explain how scales and modes are built, but if I had to sum it up, what's really important to know for beginners is that each scale and mode has a specific musical character, and you can figure out more or less what that character is just by playing up and down the scale. So that's a minor mode or scale, but different modes, for example, Locrian, will sound very different. But if you want to create a Locrian masterpiece, the notes and the chords have just aligned to it. So each mode has its own feel. Minor is typically associated with sad or serious. Major is happy or upbeat. And you may not know it, but Byzantine is associated with Pulp Fiction. Now, it may seem like this has a dizzying number of chords, but they are pretty organized. So once you select the core scale or the core intervals, then the submenu has the different modes for those note intervals. So, Hungarian minor and Ultra-Phrygian and Lydian sharp 2 and sharp 6 all have the same intervals. They just start with different notes or are different modes of the Byzantine scale. Let's talk about connectivity. Since TheoryBoard is a controller, it doesn't make any sounds on its own. You need to plug it into either a computer or iPad or iPhone, in which case it will need a separate power supply or hardware instrument like a synth or groovebox to play sounds. You can both power it and send information over USB if your source has enough juice. It also has a 3.5mm MIDI output and comes with a little dongle adapter for 5-pin MIDI cables. While we're on the topic of connectivity, it also has a sustain pedal input with a small 3.5mm jack, but it also comes with this adapter so you can plug in a regular 1/4-inch cable from a sustain pedal. Once you have a MIDI connection set up, you can choose which MIDI channel you want the left and right sides to broadcast on, so you can play chords and melodies with different instruments. In terms of build, the body of TheoryBoard is all plastic. There was an ever so slight bow in my unit, which I fixed with a tiny piece of double-sided tape on the top right corner. The control panel section in the middle has a fairly crisp screen viewable from any angle, and the touch controls below it let you navigate the menus and transpose either the left or right side, and invert or stack chords on the left. More on this later. The pads are velocity sensitive, and they also have polyphonic aftertouch if your synth supports it. Currently there's no channel aftertouch. I'm sure that can be added pretty easily. And if I compare these pads to other pad controllers, they do require slightly more force to get a note out of them, say compared to a Launchpad, Machine, or Push controller. Same goes for these capacitive touch buttons. I found that you sometimes need to click them more than once to get to what you want. It doesn't happen a lot. It's sort of like sometimes it just slows down, but overall it is pretty responsive, I'd say about 90% of the time. Oddly, the opposite applies to these buttons on the top of the screen. They sort of work as you get close to them without even touching them. I asked the company about this and they said it's something that's going to be calibrated in the production version. Okay, so those are the basics. Let's dive a little bit deeper and talk about colors, which are not for show and actually are quite important and even essential to get the most out of TheoryBoard. Each color represents the degree in the scale which you choose. Red always represents the first degree, then yellow, and so on for all the different degrees. Same goes for the chords. They're grouped based on the root note. So all of these chords are around C in this case, because I'm scaled to C. If I was an E, for example, then these would be E chords. And then that goes ahead to F, G, and so on, different options. Now there are two layouts for the left side, a more complex one with 48 chord options in a scale and a simpler one with the basic triads. We'll get to that in a bit, but the colors are important, as you can see here, because as you change modes, for example, the distribution changes based on the chords that are available in the scale. The first pad for a particular color is always the basic triad, but those triads, like I said, will move around based on the mode you're in. Now, at first I thought this was confusing, but you do get used to it. If you want to simplify it, you can always choose the simplified mode, which is available in the settings. Go to simple chord mode and turn it on. This gives you just the basic triads, in the scale, of course, across 4 octaves. So the advantage of this layout is that it's substantially clear. Everything is where it's supposed to be and you get 4 octaves, but it only plays simple triads. I think it's worth making the effort and sort of getting used to the shifting layout to enjoy all the chords that a scale can offer. You can transpose either side using these buttons on the bottom. You choose which side you control by pressing this button here. So if I wanted to transpose the 4 octave range on this side, I would press this. I can go lower. That's too low. And then if I wanted to control the left side, I'd press this again, and I get a few more options here. So for example, I could transpose this range as well, but I could also stack it by selecting more than one button. Taken to the extreme. And like I mentioned, there are a few more chord options. So let's take this basic C chord. You have a few inversion options. And also a guitar mode, which plays 6 notes. And you can also choose to drop the lowest note of the chord up to 2 or 3 octaves down. Now a quirk or an interesting thing about the way this currently works is that it will drop the lowest note of the inversion as opposed to the root note of the chord. So this works, for example, well in this case because the C is dropped. Let's say for E diminished, it's dropping the B flat. G minor, it's dropping the B flat. Even if I change inversions, I can't seem to find the root note. Again, this is nice and creative. I think it would be nice if there was a mode that would always drop the root note of the chord. And while I'm requesting features, I think it would also be nice if you could send this bass note on a different channel so you could play the bass note with a different instrument than the chord. There's one more chord option in the menus, and that's chord Strum, where you can choose a millisecond delay, which is kind of odd that you need to increase this by milliseconds, but you can strum chords, which works nicely if you stack them, of course. And there's also a mode which is fixed but based on velocity. So the harder you press, the faster it'll go. Strum is always downwards. Currently, it would be nice to have an option to have different patterns, or at the very least strum up. But regardless, a nice feature you can definitely have fun with. So those are the options for the left side. Let's take a look at a few of the options for the right side of the keyboard. Like I mentioned, you've got 4 octaves in the scale. By default, these pads aren't used, which is a shame. At the very least, it would be nice if the chords were extended beyond 1 octave. But worry not, these aren't wasted. These are reserved for live mode, which you should really have on by default. There's no reason not to currently, unless at some point they will extend the octave to the right. What live note mode does, if you turn it on, it'll place the notes of the chord you play over here. So if I were to play a simple C chord, I'd get the notes of the chord here. If I play a 4-note chord, I'd get 4 octaves of the chord here. If I wanted, I could also totally silence the left side, mute the chords. So nothing will happen when you play here, but you can see the notes change on the right side. So you can select a chord and then play that. And then another nice option, you can see that the notes will match over here based on the color of the note you're playing. But there's also an option to match the color of the chord. So you can see if you're playing, the 1 chord, the 5 chord, and so on very clearly if that's important to you. Here, too, a little feature request. These pads aren't used if you're playing a 3 or 4-note chord. It would be nice to just have this extended on to the right. So those are pretty much the features of TheoryBoard. Like I mentioned, you can choose which channel you want to broadcast on. You can turn polyphonic aftertouch on or off. You can set velocity curve ranges, which is nice. I've not been able to make this more sensitive though. It's just really much of how what you press is translated into MIDI velocity. And there's key brightness control if you want to control that. And that's pretty much it for the features of TheoryBoard. Let's talk about pros and cons. I'll start with the cons, and as usual, I'll start with the hardware side because those things are harder to change than things on the software or firmware side, though it's a Kickstarter, so who knows. The first and biggest thing I'd love for them to change is the sensitivity of the pads. Now, while they are velocity and pressure sensitive with polyphonic aftertouch, which, like I said earlier, is awesome, they're not as sensitive as pads on other pad-based instruments like the launch pads or Machine Mark III or Push. All in relative terms, of course. Light pressure seems to either get missed or sometimes trigger double notes. If I had to change one thing on the hardware, that would probably be it. The second hardware con is that there's no pitch bend or mod wheel. I asked Evan about this, and they said they're thinking about an interesting implementation using the pads. If those two are important for you, you should know that most controllers have pitch bend in a mod wheel. This doesn't. Finally, on the hardware side, there's no MIDI in. Now, currently that doesn't matter, but if an arpeggiator or sequencer are added, there's no way to sync that over 5-pin MIDI. Potentially you could over USB. Another hardware thing, there's a bit of a click when you press the buttons here. I'm told that's going to be fixed as well. So those are really the main things I could think of on the hardware side. Obviously, it would have been nice to have an actual 5-pin MIDI port and a 1/4-inch sustain pedal input, but it comes with the adapters, so there's a workaround for that. On the firmware side, I've seen a few bugs here and there and reported them, and it seems like they'll be fixed, so there's no point in talking about that. To me, the biggest thing missing is custom chords. Now, 48 chords is a fantastic palette for brainstorming in a scale, but there are a few reasons you might want more. The first reason you might want custom chords is to play specific inversions. Now, TheoryBoard will fold over chords nicely and sort of automatically play inversions, but for some chords, it's just a little bit too close. Now, I'm no music theory expert, and the closest I got to going to Berkeley was visiting the gift shop, but I would prefer to play this chord a little bit more spread out. You can use the inversions here, which helps a bit, but these inversions invert all the chords in the scale. You might just want to spread out or invert a single chord. Another good reason for custom chords is if you want to play chords out of the key or scale or mode. Now you can do that by pressing these buttons, right? So if I wanted to swap a scale, I could do that pretty easily, or swap to the parallel mode, I could do that here. But if you've got both hands busy playing a chord progression and a melody, changing modes or keys midway is just a little bit too much. Aside from that, I think it would be nice if there was a pad or chord mode that lets you use maybe 24 chords from 2 different modes instead of 48 chords from a single mode. So you could, for example, experiment with a major scale while borrowing chords from a parallel minor. Aside from the lack of custom chords, there's no sequencer or arpeggiator here. This means that if you want those features, you'll need to pair this either with a hardware sequencer, arpeggiator, or with the DAW. Now, if you do that, obviously the sky's the limit in terms of laying down different parts on a timeline, or using the built-in arpeggiator in your DAW, or even a custom arpeggiator. For example, there's this really neat piece of software called ChordPotion, which will take a static chord and create an arpeggiated pattern from it, and there's a bunch of patterns in it, and you can also choose different rhythmic options. And finally, on the feature request or software cons side, I think it would be useful to program custom colors for the different degrees, both for colorblind users, as well as in case you'd prefer a more subtle color palette than this one. So that's it for my cons or wish list features. On the pros side, TheoryBoard is a fun and useful composition and performance tool, and I don't think it's just for beginners. I think it's all too easy to get into a rut using a standard piano-style keyboard, playing in a certain comfort zone. At least I know that's what it's like for me. Now, there are plenty of software-based alternatives for this, all kinds of chord generators letting you drag chords on the screen, but that doesn't compare to actually playing them with a physical device and actually experimenting with different melodies live and in real time, especially when you do that in unfamiliar scales or modes. We're also seeing increasingly more hardware options for standalone scale-based sequencers like the Launchpad Pro Mark III or the KeyStep Pro. TheoryBoard is the easiest way I've seen to explore scales and interesting chord variations in hardware. Now, this convenience comes at a price and obviously lacks some of the features of those other controllers like a DAW integration or arpeggiator and sequencer. But if you sit in front of one, it's hard not to come up with something interesting that you'll like pretty quickly. So that's it for TheoryBoard. If you found the insights in this video useful, there are plenty more of them in my ever-expanding book of electronic music ideas, tips, and tricks available to the people who support this channel on Patreon. Hit like and don't forget to ring the notification bell if you don't want to miss the next one. Thanks for watching.